Helen was living in a remote village far from the city. She lived here with her husband all her life and buried him in the cemetery near the forest. Although the old woman was almost 80 years old, she was still growing vegetables by herself in the garden behind the house. In addition, she had chickens and even a goat. Maybe, thanks to her organic food and the good air, she was healthy and felt good. Her only son, Ben, was already tired of going to this distant village to help his elderly mother. First, he persuaded her to sell the chickens and goat, and of course it became easier for Helen to cope with household chores. The next time Ben had visited his mother, he told her that she had enough to live alone and said that she should sell the house and move to his place. At first, Helen was dumbfounded by the offer. She thought that she lived quite well and coped with everything by herself, and she did not want to disturb her son and his family in the city. But the son so outlined her good future in his family that she agreed eventually. As she was leaving, the old woman looked back at the house she had prepared for sale, and her heart ached as if she was leaving a piece of herself behind. A tear came to her eyes, and the old woman quietly asked her son to bury her next to her husband in the cemetery in the village. The son only brushed it aside, saying that it was too early to talk about it. Helen was given a small room in the apartment, but she didn't mind. The family was large and the children needed a lot of space. She wasn't complaining. She was getting used to her new life. The elderly woman spent her days watching TV and playing with her grandchildren. At first, she even cooked a meal, but her daughter-in-law wasn't pleased with her help. One day, Ben said that the house had finally sold and that he would use the proceeds to buy a car. Helen tried to argue because she would like to buy a small apartment for her, so she wouldn't bother him and his family. But Ben got angry and even raised his voice at Helen for the first time. He didn't understand at all what was wrong with his mother, because he gave her a place to live, took care, cooked for her, and did not bother with anything. Helen decided that her son had some trouble at work. Thus he snapped at her. The next morning she was going to make breakfast for Ben, but on her way she ran into him. "Why are you getting in my way? Go back and sleep," he snapped at her. The mother looked at her son confused, then turned around and went to her room. In the evening she decided to speak with her daughter-in-law to find out if her son was doing well and why he was so irritable. But her daughter-in-law only told her not to distract her with nonsense and to go to her room. No one called Helen to dinner that evening. From that day on, her attitude changed. Apparently, her son had no problems at work. To Helen's dismay, she realized that she was the problem for her son. Ben and his wife almost stopped talking to her, and if they did, they only complained. For example, she was going to the wrong place or at the wrong time. She was taking food that she bought for some dish. She was using the toilet when the kids needed it urgently. The elderly woman tried to be inconspicuous, cooked meals when no one saw her, bought her own groceries. She often remembered her cottage, dreamed of going to her husband's grave or visiting her neighbour from the village. One day she determinedly packed her things. Before she left, she knocked on her son's door and told him she was leaving. But her son shouted at her through the door not to do anything foolish. Helen sighed and left the apartment. She reached her village towards evening. The woman clutched the phone in her hands all the way home in case her son would call, but no one did. It had already become dark, and no one saw the lonely old woman walking slowly down the street. She had no idea what she would be doing when she would see her old house. Helen came to her house and noticed that there were no lights on in the house, and she assumed that no one lived there all the time. Since it was already night time, she decided to spend the night at least in the barn. In the morning she awoke by the creaking of doors. She opened her eyes and saw a dazed man staring at her. Helen jumped up, frightened, and began to apologize, making up that she had missed the last bus and had nowhere to sleep for the night. Adam, the new owner of the house, was also confused. He realized that the elderly woman was lying, because he recognized her as the former landlady of the house. His relatives lived in the neighbouring village, and he remembered her very well. The man invited Helen into the house and treated her with breakfast. Over the breakfast, Adam and his wife questioned Helen a little, and they realized that she had nowhere to go. Adam's wife was a kind woman and was very concerned about this unknown elderly lady. In privacy, she immediately told her husband that she would not be able to sleep well if she knew that Helen would be sleeping on the street. As a result, the couple offered the elderly woman to stay with them. When Helen heard this, her hands trembled with excitement. She hadn't expected strangers to be more sympathetic than her own son. Adam's wife immediately started preparing the room for Helen. She made the beds, cleared out the closet. When the elderly woman came into the room, she started crying. The couple looked at each other, and Adam's wife hurried into the next room, as she had tears streaming down her cheeks from pity for this poor woman. When she calmed down, Helen sat down on the bed and prayed. She prayed that God would forgive her good-for-nothing son, and that he would give her new family health and prosperity.